Stop Wishing, Start Writing podcast with Dr. Robert Lefkowitz. Boy, are you in for a treat. It's when reading the book, there were so many stars and underline and dog-eared pages and so forth. So it is just a privilege to join you today. And I'm so glad that you have carved time out of your schedule to be with us. So let's jump right in with a quick intro. You already know that Dr. Robert Lefkowitz, who has asked me to call him Bob, so in case you think I'm getting too familiar, no, he has asked that I call him Bob and you call him Bob as well. He won the Nobel Prize for chemistry in 2012. You already know that Dr. Bob is associated with Duke University. You probably already know that he is one of the Yellow Berets, 10 of which who have run the Nobel Prize, who have made revolutionary discoveries and therapies for heart disease and cancer and diabetes. What you may not know about Dr. Bob is that when he received his Nobel, that a local Swedish newspaper said that he was the happiest laureate that they had ever encountered, and you're about to find out why. And what you may not know is that there was an outpouring of respect and affection for this man, his work, and his legacy. In fact, just a few, and I mean a few, of the dozens of 5-star reviews on Amazon and testimonials for his book. One is from Coach K, who Bob was telling me has just decided to hang up his sneakers after 40 years at Duke. And Coach K says that this book unveils the teamwork, persistence, and labors of love that go into living a life of significance. By turns funny and moving, this book has the power to inspire. And I hope you are ready to be inspired. Please help me welcome Nobel Prize winner and author of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm, Dr. Bob Lefkowitz. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that overly generous introduction.
Shucks. Well, we're going to jump in because we have 45 minutes with you today. You have carved time out of your schedule, and there are so many questions. So let's start with, there's got to be a backstory behind the title for this book. Could you tell us that, please?
Well, I think the title, of course, is a takeoff on A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. But it seemed appropriate because humor plays a big part in my life and my style of mentoring and interacting with people. I'm always telling stories, some of them of which have a kind of a funny context to them. And so we sort of put that sort of humorous perspective together with the long road to winning a Nobel Prize, and we came up with that title.
You know, it's that title is a tip of the iceberg title because, as you said, it tells a story, and it tells that this is not going to be a policy wonk book, that this is going to be a page turner, because you talk about the importance of stories right in the introduction. So can you please tell us why stories are so important to your role as a physician, to your role as a scientist, and to your role as an author?
Well, I've always loved stories, hearing stories and telling stories. But I think my, shall we say, professional interest in storytelling was really awakened when I was a third-year medical student. And I remember the exact moment when I learned that very important lesson. It was my very first clinical rotation as a third-year medical student. You know, the first 2 years of medical school, you're taking courses and working in a lab. And then the third and fourth year, you're doing clinical work. So I was on my very first clinical rotation on internal medicine. The very first day on rounds with the attending physician, interns, residents, and other students, I was asked to present a case, which I did. It was discussed by the attending, who was a remarkable man, and now deceased, named Mortimer Bader. When I was all done and we had finished the diagnosis and differential diagnosis, he really flummoxed me by asking me to represent the case with the following constraints. One, I could not change any facts of the case, not the history, the physical examination, or the lab results. But two, I must tell a different story. Well, as I say, I was flummoxed. I couldn't imagine how you could keep the same facts but tell a different story. So I just said, I can't do it. So he ran around the room asking the interns, the residents, nobody could do it. He then proceeded to demonstrate what he was talking about. He took all the same facts, changed nothing, and yet he told a rather different story. What was different is that he left certain things out. He emphasized others more. He put the details of the story in a different sequence, different emphasis. And in fact, it led to a somewhat different differential diagnosis, which actually led to the correct diagnosis, whereas my story hadn't. And so what I learned from that was that data, in this case, clinical data, are not a story. A story is something that you impose on the data with your own creativity, insight, knowledge, instinct, etc. What I would subsequently learn later in my career is that in research, in science, and in discovery, storytelling is, if anything, even more important than the clinical arena, because learning how to tell a story is absolutely crucial to writing a scientific paper. And when we think we have all the data that we need for a paper, what I should do is I sit down with my students and fellows. We have the data arranged as sort of figure panels, and we start moving them around. Well, we could tell the story with this is figure 1, and this is the last figure. We could turn it around. The last figure could be the first figure. That's a totally different story, or any other combination. And we try them out. And sooner or later, you hit on the best story, which really brings everything into focus. So storytelling, to me, is a crucial part of scientific storytelling and clinical case analysis, the two basic aspects of my career.
And isn't this a wonderful analogy? So story imposed on data, well, story imposed on life. I think the first time you and I talked, we quoted Tara Conklin, who said that the story you tell about yourself is your greatest work of art. And as you said, with the life, we can have the same data. What story are we choosing to tell about the set of facts and data in our life, right?
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. Coincidentally, I was talking with somebody earlier today, it doesn't matter who it was, and this guy who was not a scientist was telling me about a course he had taken in neuroscience once about emotions and memory and this and that. He didn't quite understand it, what he was talking about. So I clarified for him that there is scientific data that shows that memories, the mechanism of this is even known biochemically. Experiences that you have or things that you hear or experience that are accompanied by significant emotion, be it positive or negative, are remembered more tightly and more closely than those that are experiences that you have which are not accompanied by emotion. And so, and I won't go bore you with the details of the biochemistry of why that should be. It has to do basically with the biochemistry of how memories are created. Mm-hmm. But so that means consider the following. You're looking at an 8x8 table of numbers and data. Okay, it's hard to have much emotion associated with that. But now, suppose instead of looking at the data, somebody tells you a story and you have sort of an aha. Ooh, now that's interesting. You're going to remember that, but right. You're not going to remember the other.
Bob, your table of contents is Exhibit A of everything you've talked about so far, because I'm going to share just a few of your chapter titles, because your chapter titles tell a story. Your chapter titles have emotion in them. Your chapter titles have humor in them. So here are just a few of the great chapters, and then we're going to talk about some of the highlights. Duke, never heard of it. 2,000 frogs a week. Now, come on, what memoir about a scientist physician are you expecting to see 2,000 frogs a week as a chapter title?
Right.
And then there's Jeopardy. We got to hear the Jeopardy story. Eat more chocolate, win more Nobel Prizes. So, although first I want to ask the story about how you met your writing partner, because that's a story too. Let's hear it, please.
Okay, so it's not actually how I met him, but it's how we decided to work together on this project. Right. So Randy Hall, my co-author, now a professor of pharmacology at Emory University in Georgia, had been a postdoctoral fellow in my laboratory in the 1990s. He was always kind of one of my favorites. Of course, they're all my favorites, but I mean, I really hit it off with Randy. And one of the things we bonded over was the fact that he, like I, was an ardent Duke basketball fan. So after he left my laboratory, which I'm going to say would be probably late 90s, and moved to Emory, we kept up. And since I had season tickets to the Duke basketball games, I'd say once every few years he would come up for a game, and we'd have dinner together and we'd go to the game together. Well, I guess about 4 years ago, whatever, he was up for that occasion, and we were having dinner together, and he was trying to talk me into writing a book about all my stories. And that was nothing new. He had been after me for a number of years, as had many of my students and fellows. But I always said, nah, I don't have time. I'm not going to do it. And so he said, he finally made a pitch. He said, look, you know the Richard Feynman book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. I said, yeah. And he says, you know how that was written? I was a little foggy on that. And then I remembered when he told me about it. He said he basically told his stories to an acolyte, a former trainee who was by that time a professor of physics somewhere, just like Feynman was a physicist. And then the co-author, in that case, transcribed the stories. Feynman edited them, and that became a book. Now, of course, if you remember that book, it really isn't a memoir. It also really isn't a coherent narrative. It's just a bunch of stories. But Randy said, look, how about this? You tell me your stories. We'll try to arrange them chronologically and see if we can't turn it into the story of your life, but illustrated by your stories. I said, well, let me think about it. But I finally said, you know, if I'm ever going to do it, this is the way to do it. And so we embarked on the mission together. We started off spending an hour and a half on the phone every week. It grew to be more like 2 hours a session. I would tell him my stories. He would occasionally ask questions for further context and development. He would record the conversations. Then he would write up the stories, try to come up with a narrative structure, which was coherent, send drafts to me. I would edit them. We'd go back and forth any number of times. And one by one, the chapters took form. And that's how the book came to be.
Okay, now we have a room full of writers live on the call with us, and many people are going to be watching this in the future. So let's summarize a little bit of what we've learned. Look at your table of contents and ask yourself, does it have emotion? Do people relate to the titles and want to know more? Look at the table of contents. Does it have humor? Something gets people's eyebrows up and actually promises that this book could even be fun? Does it have humor and emotion and also story? Do you want to know the rest of the story? Because when you look at a table of contents that has humor, storytelling, and that has emotion, you have just created curiosity. It's going to be one of the best marketing pieces for your book. And now also, let's think about Dr. Bob's process, because a key word was that he interviewed you chronologically. So there was a sequential flow. So as you said, it wasn't just a mishmash of stories. It pulled you in and you kept wanting to know what next, because he imposed that organized story and structure on your life. Is that fair to say?
I couldn't have said it better myself, Sam. And, you know, you might be surprised to hear that these same principles I'm always talking to my students and fellows about in terms of writing scientific papers. And you might say, what in the world could writing a dry scientific paper have to do with the process you just described? Mm-hmm. But I can just hear in my head how many times I've said this. You know, as scientists, we're overwhelmed by the vastness of the literature. You can't, even in your own field, even in a narrow aspect, it's impossible to keep up with everything. Every week, each of us looks at dozens of journals. And for the most part, you scan the table of contents, but there isn't much more time than that. Now, out of all the titles that you scan, a trivial fraction will you actually read the summary or abstract. So I make the point to them, how do you decide which 1% are you going to read the abstract? Well, the answer is the title. If the title sucks you in, then you say, okay, what do they have to say? Now comes the abstract. Well, of all the papers you read the abstract, maybe 1% you'll go on to read the paper because the abstract tells you what it's doing. But if the abstract is interesting enough to really capture you, then they read the paper. So when people say to me, well, what do I write first? You write the title and the abstract. When you have the title and the abstract down, the rest just sort of flows. But you wouldn't believe the way people write papers. That's, for most scientists, that seems to be the last thing they write. They figure, well, we'll write the paper. When the paper's done, I'll summarize what I just did. Anyway, so I think there's some real similarities in scientific writing to the kind of general narrative that you just described.
Isn't it so, what you're saying about we have 60 seconds to get people's attention, right? And this is not the title and the abstract or the opening page or the opening paragraph, they are not an afterthought. They are a forethought, right? Because they will be the lead domino as to whether the brilliant work, the hours you poured in, it is going to be a deal maker or a deal breaker as to whether it even gets read.
Absolutely. And I don't remember the first line of the book, but I think it has me lying on a gurney in a catheterization table, having a cardiac cath, and discovering in that instant that I had coronary artery disease and was heading down a rough path.
I was starting to get loopy from the drugs. My friend Dave stood over me wielding a giant needle.
Exactly right. And it's exactly true.
Oh, tell me more. See, does the opening sentence, does the title, does the table of contents just compel you to want to know more? So well done. Okay, now in a moment, we're going to talk about the art of mentoring, which it deserves to be a book in itself. It's one of the many things you're known for, not just with your scientific children, all of the people that you have poured into over the years. And first, though, we want to give a shout out to Dr. Ruth Godian. Is that the reason why we are gifted with your presence and your wisdom tonight is because she made a wonderful introduction for us. Of course, she's the author of The Success Factor. She interviewed Olympians and Nobel Prize winners and Academy Award winners and leading founders and tried to dissect and then pinpoint the factors that contributed to significant success. So Dr. Ruth Godian, will you join us for a moment, please? And do you have a shout out or a question that you'd like to give Bob, please?
Hey, Sam. Hey, Bob. Hey, everyone.
Hello.
I am just sitting here just like a proud mama. I am so excited for Bob because I know he's given a gazillion interviews, but I never got to watch one before. And it's incredible. I read Bob's book. I have 10 pages of notes on it. But I first met Bob when I was getting my doctorate, and he's one of the people who I interviewed, and I was so fascinated because he's the only one who talked so openly about his failures, which is something that resonates throughout the book. In fact, in my notes when I read this book, I wrote unbashfully honest and transparent. And when I was getting the releases for my book, for The Success Factor, Bob emailed me and he said, oh, I just came out with my own book. And I'm thinking, oh boy, because other Nobel Prize winners have written books and I've read them and they're kind of dry. And I read Bob's book on the plane to California, and I was sitting on the plane hysterically laughing out loud. By the time I landed in California, I must have texted a dozen friends saying, you have to read this book. It was so good. It was so incredible. And you think it would be all about the Nobel. That's only a small piece. This is really the journey to get there. And I'm just a proud mom.
Well,
Just a proud mama today.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I very much have enjoyed our relationship over the last couple of years, and I thank you for this introduction to Sam.
And I'm here to learn from you guys.
We all thank you, Ruth. Thanks so much. So, and now segueing, dovetailing off what Ruth just said, is that one word titled Jeopardy. And interestingly, it was a little bit of a snafu that then you quickly took action to correct. And yet there was a story. You got a phone call, and it was who telling you what about Jeopardy, please?
Okay, so it was Uncle Henry. Uncle Henry was married to my mother's sister, spoke with a thick Yiddish accent, which I can't emulate or imitate. He had known me since the day I was born, quite literally. And at the time of this phone call, he's about 91 years old. He lives in New York City, and he has been a devoted fan of Jeopardy, the game show, for decades. He's just watched it, and he calls me up. I still remember, it was about 6:15. My wife and I were having dinner. And he says, with this thick Yiddish accent, Bobby, I am so, without any, introduction, I pick up the phone. He says, Bobby, I'm so proud of you. I said, how come, Uncle Henry? He says, you were just a question on Jeopardy. I said, I was a question on Jeopardy. What was the question? He says, who knows? But you were a question on Jeopardy. So I said, oh, okay. Well, that's of course, my mind is racing. I can't imagine how I could have been a question on Jeopardy. I did find out subsequently. And he says, I was so proud of you. He says, you're so famous. He says, when you go to Scotland, I'm going with you. And I said, Scotland, Uncle Henry, why am I going to Scotland? Why would I go to Scotland? He says, you know, when you go to Scotland. I said, why would I go to Scotland, Uncle Henry? He says, when you win that big prize. I said, oh, you mean Stockholm? He says, Stockholm, Scotland, what's the difference? It's a whole backstory as to why I was on there. I could tell you that story, but it'd take a while.
Okay, now let's look at Bob's process. He puts us in the scene. I mean, he didn't just say, I picked up the phone. He said, I picked up the phone. So he's acting it out. So we're seeing what you're saying. We're in the scene with you. It's as if it's happening right now because you recreate the dialogue. He says this, I say this. This is why we can read novels for hours at a time and it's not hard work, is because the best authors do exactly what you do, and you did it with a nonfiction book. So where did you get this ability to make a story come alive?
This is a wonderful question. Neither of my parents, to the best of my knowledge, ever said a funny thing in their life. I don't ever remember either of them saying a funny thing, ever. In fact, bless his soul, my dad was, as with many immigrant Jewish families in northeastern cities, we had a family organization called the Associated Kremsdorf Descendants. It was quite a big organization of actually more than 100 people, all of whom were descended from a family named Kremsdorf, all of whom had emigrated from Eastern Europe, fortunately, obviously, before the Second World War. So we had an organization. And it was a lot of fun. I probably talk a little bit about it in the book. But my father did a 4-year term as president of this organization, which was really a hoot because it was sort of a parody of itself. I mean, they had meetings once a month at a social hall, and they operated according to Robert's Rules of Order. They had committees. But the whole thing wasn't even serious. But anyway, my father was president, and the poor guy liked to open every meeting with a joke, but he was completely unfunny. So he had a book, I still remember, it's called ASOS, ESAU apostrophe S, Esau's joke dictionary. And they were all groaners, okay? They weren't the least bit funny. And when he told them, they were even less funny, okay? But he would open every one. So neither of my parents even had a sense of humor. They never told stories. So I don't know where that came from. I have a number of personality characteristics, which are totally at variance with my parents. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that although there's nature, there's nurture, but there's really something else, which is the individual. I mean, each of us is a unique individual, and you can't necessarily attribute characteristics that we have to either parent or any obvious fusion of their characteristics and personalities.
Guess what, Bob? Do you know how Einstein knew he had a good idea?
No.
He laughed out loud.
Oh, I love that. That's a wonderful quote.
Well, and laughter is intellectual delight, isn't it? So see, what is science but discovery? What in your work, it is all working hard, and then the light goes on and the band plays and the dots connect and coalesce. And what can you do but laugh with the pure joy of discovery and having just, you don't stumble upon it, but having poured in the concerted effort that pays off in a laugh and something new, right?
Absolutely correct, Sam. I mean, in my lab meetings, which we have every week and which can stretch for hours, I use a lot of humor. I try to get people laughing, which I find is not very difficult. And I find the more that people laugh, the more there's sort of an enhanced sort of community creativity. Ideas just start flying around. And I often make the point that, and you were really getting at this, that in the moment, humor is basically the juxtaposing of ideas or things or situations that most people wouldn't ordinarily see as connected in any way. And what the joke or the funny comment does is bring together seemingly disparate things. And in the moment that that somebody sees the joke, okay, they're making a little discovery, okay? Let me give you what is to me one of the most vivid examples in my own mind from my own experience of this. So I have 5 married children. Each of them at their weddings, as the proud papa, I made remarks, okay? And my youngest, who's now 45, was getting married, I guess must be now about 12, 13 years ago. And so I got up to make remarks. And the first thing I said was the following, which is politically very incorrect, I'm sure, but what can you do? I said, you know, Josh, when your mother, so remember at the time he's the 5th pregnancy. So I said, and they're fairly close together. I said, Josh, you know, when your mother told me that she was pregnant for the 5th time, I wasn't initially all that thrilled about it. I said, because, you know, the day before I had just read an article in the paper that said that every 5th child born in the world is Chinese. Well, now what happened was the following. After a brief instant, okay, you could hear a wave of laughter, okay? Then, half a second later, another wave, and then another wave, and then another wave, as different people got the joke and saw the ridiculous, you know, sort of association I was making, okay? And it was fascinating to me because I don't ever remember saying anything in which the lag phase was so variable. Some people got it like that. Others took 2 or 3 seconds, but by the end, everybody was roaring, okay? And again, it was a perfect example of each one was making the discovery. And in the moment that you make that discovery, so I always try to encourage any humorous tendencies my trainees have, but I always caution them along the following lines. It's my observation that there are only 2 kinds of people in the world. It's a bimodal distribution. People are either funny or they're not funny. Okay, now everybody has the ability to appreciate humor, but not everybody has the ability to be funny. And it's very important to know which of the two categories you fall into. Okay, I mean, there's no crime in being an unfunny person. But the problem is if you're not funny and you try to be funny, it's sort of grotesque because everybody knows how cringe-inducing it is to listen to somebody who's not funny try to be funny, right? You just want to crawl under the table. My father was such a person. And every once a month when he would open those meetings by trying to be funny, I just wanted to crawl under my chair because he wasn't funny at all.
Here's the good news is that first, I love you talked about the evolution of comprehension, right? When you tell a joke, there are some people and the light bulb goes on immediately, and then other people, but they're looking around to make sure it's okay to laugh, right? Did you really mean this? Is it acceptable to laugh?
Right,
and do you know
exactly.
do you know what comedians do when there's a lag like that in humor?
No.
They look at the audience and they kind of arch an eyebrow and they'll say, I'll wait.
Right, yes.
Right. Which is kind of permission to laugh and cement the fact that, yeah, it was intended to be funny. And like, if you're just coming around to it.
And, you know, I think that's why humor is such a good prod to creativity, because it gets your mind working in a way where you're attuned to the fact that things might not be exactly how they look on the surface. You know, you got to always be part of making discoveries is being open to making discoveries. Okay, almost anticipating making discoveries, and humor sort of helps with that process.
Your book, once again, is a poster child for this, Bob, because I'm on page 249 right now. And this is where you have gleaned, you have distilled of all of your decades of mentoring, the 10 characteristics or actions or steps people can take. But guess how you introduce this? You introduce it with a story and with a humorous quote from Yogi Berra. Now, I'm not going to step on your quote by Yogi Berra. You know the one I'm talking about, though, right?
Yes, I think I do.
Okay, run with it, Bob.
There are so many wonderful Yogi quotes. He's my favorite philosopher, I always tell people. But it really has to do with the concept of flow or being in the flow. And so Yogi, for those of you who don't know, was the catcher for the New York Yankees during what's generally referred to as the golden age of baseball, first half of the 1950s. His uniform number was 8, and I loved Yogi. My only player that I loved more was Mickey Mantle, whose number was 7. Mickey batted third and Yogi batted cleanup or fourth. Well, Yogi was a great hitter. He had a career average just a little bit below 300. But when Yogi came up in the clutch, he was amazing. By the clutch, I mean something like bottom of the 9th inning, the team's down by a run or 2, runners on base, 2 out, and Yogi's at the plate. You could take it to the bank. He was going to get a hit, usually a home run. So he was being interviewed by a sports reporter, and he was asked the question, Yogi, it's so amazing what a clutch hitter you are with all that pressure. So tell us how you do it. When you're up in that clutch situation, what are you thinking? And Yogi looked at the guy and he said, thinking? How are you going to think and hit at the same time? And I think that just goes to the issue of being in the flow and not thinking. I mean, of course you're thinking, but you're not thinking about thinking. You're just doing. You're in the moment. You are the moment. I have a lot of moments like that.
See, and we are a student of your craft today, Bob, because what you did in this chapter is most people would just do the obvious thing. I am going to talk about my 10 lessons learned about mentoring. It's dull, or as Ruth would say, a little dry, right? So you were not content to be common. You understood that title and abstract for this chapter would not win our interest or compel us to keep reading, right?
Right.
So you used Yogi's story as over the years, people had said, boy, you're such an excellent mentor. When are you going to share your lessons learned? And so you used Yogi's quote as like you were doing the work. You really at that point didn't have time to step out and look back and reflect on and produce this methodology that was a reflection of the work, right?
Absolutely. And, it's interesting as you mentioned that, I can tell you that I'm like Yogi in the following way. I mean, for the first number, I guess my career stretches back more than 50 years, but I've been at Duke right around 50 years, 49, but who's counting? And for the up until the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, if you asked me, how much time, Bob, have you thought about how you mentor and what are the secrets of your success? I'd say zero. I never thought about mentoring. I really didn't think about it until, now that I'm a Nobel Prize winner, everybody wants to know, how did I get here? Now I'm thinking about it, okay? But I never thought about it. I just did it, okay? Now, why did I do it? I don't know. That's just me. That's how I did it. And now I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and even writing about it in the hopes that it'll be helpful to other people. And there are some principles, but I mean, I think the one overriding principle is that there's no one right way to mentor. If I would have to tell people, it would be for you, the best way for you to mentor is to follow some principles, and I've given it my shot, but you have to do it in a way that is authentically you. You can't imitate me, I always tell people. That would be a mistake because you're not me. You have to mentor in a way that is authentically you and comes across as authentically you. And I think authenticity is one of my core values, I would have to say.
Yeah. Authenticity and, one of your 10 principles of mentoring and what you've learned along the way. So 30-second story and then over to you is that I had a chance to see Elon Musk speak at the National Press Club. And I asked a question that my son, Tom, who works for NASA, said, ask Elon Musk this question. And the question was, he said, my mom, my job's safe. I'm with the ISS. Everyone with the shuttle has been laid off and they're all applying to SpaceX. And he said, ask him how people can get an interview and a job. And Elon Musk said one of the most brilliant one-liners I've ever heard in my life. He said, don't tell me about the positions you've held. Tell me about the problems you've solved. And now one of your principles is to focus on the problems, not the techniques. Now, what's the story behind that, please?
The story behind that is that throughout my career, I have tried to choose problems which intuitively seem to me fertile and important. And the whole issue of how do you learn to choose such problems is a whole separate issue. It has a lot to do with mentoring because it's really a matter of values and developing a certain set of values for what's important, not just important, but potentially solvable. But in my quest to solve important problems, at different phases of my career, I have used widely varying techniques, okay? Now, of course, nobody knows how to do every complicated technique. And in fact, the techniques we use in my lab today weren't even invented when I started out. But you can always find somebody who can either import the technique to your lab or teach you the technique or teach one of your students the technique, etc. But from time to time, I'll have somebody who, say, was in my lab in the 1980s when we were doing a lot of Technique C. And they leave the lab to start their own thing. And they're an expert in Technique C. And for 10 years, they're able to really make a go of it by finding things you can do with Technique C. But any technique has a short half-life because they're always replaced by other techniques which are better, more powerful, etc. And so I always tell people, if you're going to make your career out of a technique that's looking for a problem, you're going to have a short career. Now, if you make your career out of solving problems, regardless of what the technology is, then you can have a very long career. So that's the story behind that.
Well, as authors, I hope we're all taking this to heart and asking ourselves, if this is a nonfiction book, in the first 3 pages, do we actually say the words, what problem am I solving, right? Or what problem is this book addressing? And if it's fiction, in the first 3 pages, what problems are my characters facing, right? Because if not, then a nonfiction book is do this, do this, do this, do this. And as you said, it will have a half-life because there will be a new book with new techniques said different ways, but problems are eternal and are core and seminal in a way that they are enduring, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think the key, I think if people knew how to write well, I think almost anybody could write a good memoir, because every life is filled with problems, and every life is filled with interesting experiences. It's just a matter of seeing that. I mean, I'm one of these fairly gregarious people that, to me, everybody has a story. And when I'm in a social situation, whoever I'm talking to, I want to get their story. I think that comes from my years as a physician, because frankly, of the various ways you can make a diagnosis, history, physical, and then lab tests, the one that has really fallen by the wayside is taking a good history. Today, the medical students, they basically do it. And physical exam is all but forgotten, as I'm sure most of you know. My wife's a physician, I'm told by my wife, doesn't even have her undress when she goes for her annual physical. So the physical is pretty much gone. It's all lab tests. But I'm telling you, the key to making diagnoses is taking a good history. I love taking a history, so in a social situation, my feeling is if I'm at a dinner and I'm sitting next to somebody I have not met before, I love that. I want to get their story and find out what's interesting about it.
Well, we as authors, Bob, we would like to get 2 last stories from you. It's and so I'll give you a preview of the 2 questions. We've got a little less than 5 minutes left. And so the first is, what has been one of the most rewarding aspects about writing this book? So maybe you have a story where you thought, if that single thing had happened as a result of writing this book, it would have all been worth it. So that's the first question. And then the second one will be, for all of our people, some are published authors with several books, some are still in the process. If you had to give one single piece of advice about writing a book, what would that be? So back to something rewarding that's happened as a result of writing your book.
I think the most rewarding thing about writing the book is the people who I've been brought into contact with, like yourself, Ruth, and many others whom I wouldn't have met or had the opportunity to interact with. Like anybody else, I mean, there are only so many hours in a day, and you only get to meet so many people. Most of the people I interact with are people like me, physicians, scientists, etc. Well, that's a very restricted group of human beings. And so, yeah, I've gotten to meet all sorts of fascinating people and learn all kinds of fascinating things. So that I'd say that's probably the best part of it.
So book writing is a way of catalyzing an expansion of meeting new simpatico souls, right?
100%. I really like the way you said that.
And how about advice? If someone was thinking about writing a book, especially if they're kind of in their dark night of the soul and it's taking a long time and they're wondering if it's worth it, what would you suggest?
Well, of course, I'm not the ideal person to ask that, since I imagine most of the time writing a book is a very solitary, a very lonely experience even. But for me, it was sheer fun because I was doing it with this guy who I really liked. And, I would talk and he would come back and we'd go back and forth. So, I guess it would be kind of foolish advice to say, find a co-author. But yeah, to me, that was, was an unusual way to do a book. I realized that, in the sort of the genre is as told to. So I can't really comment in a knowing sort of way about advice, just because my experience was so not unique, but different in terms of working with another author.
Although, guess what? And by the way, if you have a comment a thanks or appreciation that you'd like to give to Bob, or something in particular about his book that really resonated with you, please put it in chat, because we'll pass that on and make sure that he sees your accolades and your comments about how and why his work really made a difference for you. It's interesting what you just said, Bob, because look at the river that runs through this conversation. You've talked about the importance of making it fun. You've talked about the importance of juxtaposing things and doing the opposite of the always. And that's when the light goes on and it's energizing. So see, working, it doesn't have to be a writing partner, right? Maybe it's just someone who's working on their book. And the 1 + 1 = 11 joy of going it together as opposed to alone just imbues the writing process and makes it a little bit more of a fun scientific experiment instead of just a solo journey, huh?
Absolutely. I saw a question flash across the chat. Can I respond to it very quickly?
Yes, you bet you
see the
can.
whole question, but
Please
just
do.
because it speaks to something which I've thought about and actually talked about. The question was something to this effect. I just saw the first line or two. Is that, are there some subjects that you really can't deal with in writing or talking about them, such as domestic violence? Is that, are there some subjects that are just taboo? And again, I have never written about that topic, but I have often told the following story, that in my career as a physician, especially making rounds in the hospital, I have on innumerable occasions found myself with my entourage of learners, students, and residents at the bedside of people who are extraordinarily ill, and in many cases moribund, who are dying and know that they're dying. And I pride myself that regardless of how sick a patient is, by the time we leave the room, I can make them smile and in many cases laugh, no matter how sick they are, okay? Now, how do you do that? Well, it's a very fine line that you're walking, but it can be done. So I suspect that there is almost no topic that can't be dealt with. Just because you're using humor doesn't mean you're trivializing or being silly or making fun of something, okay? You're just adding a perspective. And frankly, what better could you do for a dying patient, especially one who knows they're dying, than get them to laugh at something? And, frankly, that for that patient, the most important thing you may have done on rounds is get them to laugh, not change the dose of chemo.
Wow, what a profound and unexpected insight about, regardless of what we're writing about, whatever topic or subject, is there the saving grace of humor in that work somewhere, right?
Saving grace is exactly it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. Kendra, is there one more question? I wish we had time to take everyone's questions and so forth. Is there one other that you've seen? And then we want to honor our time with you, Bob. You've been very gracious with your time. So one question and we'll wrap it up. Kendra, anyone that you'd like to highlight or showcase, please?
We didn't have many questions. I don't know that we asked for them in the comments, but we had a lot of nice comments about Dr. Bob. So Terry says, this was delightful and brilliant. My daughter is a STEM professor, which makes me very interested in how scientists and their students can communicate their work effectively with humor. This was perfect. So
thank you very much. I'm glad you appreciated it.
Well, see, you're mentoring yet again, Bob, is that we really hope that just as you mentioned, Kendra and Teresa, you're going to share this with your daughter, that this video is going to be available and that you share it with people who are writing a book or going into STEM, studying medicine in the medical field, are scientists, because what a wonderful perspective about how we can continue to do our work in a way that matters and how we can touch people, whether they are in the hospital and in their last days, or whether it is someone working around us, and we are passing along an approach to their work that will help them stand out and expand their impact, and how we can do it with heart, and how we can do it with the saving grace of humor, and how we can do it with a significant mind towards making a difference that uplifts and is a rising tide for all involved. Thank you so much, Dr. Robert Lefkowitz, Dr. Bob, for gracing us with your wisdom tonight.
Thank you very much, Sam. I very much enjoyed the conversation. The evidence for which is I've just looked at the time on my screen here, 8:22. I would have thought it might be about 7:35. The time, I don't know where it went, but it went by very quickly indeed.
What a joy. Thank you so much. We're going to be continuing to recommend your work and spreading the word about your wonderful book and all of your contributions. Thank you once again.
Thank you all very much. Enjoyed it. Ruth, nice to see you as well. Bye-bye, everybody.